tribe stole his plane. Last year, an Arizona tribe seized my airplane for trespassing, and this is after they'd given me permission to land at their airport twice. Now, I thought this was outrageous enough to be a one-off, but I was wrong. It was a template, and it just happened again, except this time it's even worse. In Minnesota right now, there's another airplane sitting on a reservation's impound lot after a pilot lost his engine during flight and pulled off a textbook emergency landing on a state highway.
Full stop, have hotel. I'm sputtering in and out and losing power. I've pulled carb heat. Everything else is in the green. Looks like my oil pressure has dropped.
Nobody was hurt, no property was damaged. He did exactly what we're trained to do when the propeller stops.
I have no engine. I have touchdown.
The tribal police then showed up, they helped secure the scene, and they told him they were keeping the airplane. Not because he's clipped a power pole, not because he'd landed on their runway without permission, and not even because he'd landed on a highway that was public, not even under the tribe's jurisdiction, by the way. Nope. It was all because of a tribal resolution that they passed in 1978 that says no airplane is allowed to fly below 20,000 feet above their land. Now, this tribe's claim to the airspace doesn't show up on any FAA aeronautical charts, doesn't show up in the NOTAMs. It even has a low altitude IFR route that goes right over the Red Lake tribe.
The absolute worst place to live in America, Red Lake County, Minnesota.
So they're using this airspace infraction that's not published anywhere, that isn't made public in any way, as the basis for seizing a guy's airplane after he made an emergency landing on a state highway.
Red Lake, Minnesota, got seized.
I'll cut to the chase, guys. What happened here, plain and simple, the tribe stole his plane. Let me walk you through how it happened. Our main character this time's name is Darren Smedsmo. He's from Roseau, Minnesota. He flies a 1946 Stinson 108-1. It's a classic tail dragger, 4 seats, fabric wings, and an aluminum frame. It's the kind of airplane that you fly because you love flying. Now on October 15th, he takes off from Roseau. He's headed down to Bemidji for an instrument training. And if you draw a straight line between the two on the sectional, Roseau to Bemidji runs right through the Red Lake Nation Reservation and over the lower Red Lake. He'd flown this very route many times, and on the chart it looks frankly boring. There's no restricted airspace, there's no tribal advisory box, there's even a low altitude IFR route that's running over that same geography. Now, you could cruise that path all day at normal altitudes and never know that anybody had any sort of claim or had a problem with you doing so. He's flying at about 3,500 feet MSL over the lake when his engine starts to sputter. The propeller stops, and there's nothing but silence. Every pilot knows this exact moment, at least in their imagination. During their final test before licensing, every pilot is forced into this exact simulated emergency. It's probably the emergency scenario that pilots worry about the most. So, following his training, he sets up for the best glide, he checks the wind. Where can he put this thing down without killing anyone? He picks Minnesota Highway 189 on the west side of the reservation. He's familiar with this road, he's traveled it hundreds of times. Straight stretch, reasonable options, better than the trees or the cold water, which are his only other options. He glides in, lands on the pavement, and rolls to a stop. High on adrenaline, he gets out. Nobody dies, nobody's injured, no houses get hit. The airplane looks like new. In terms of emergencies, this is the absolute best case scenario. Total win. Once the emergency is over, the trouble starts. Tribal law enforcement responds to the scene, and to their credit, the first part goes fine. Every interaction is courteous, they check on him, they secure the scene, they make sure that a secondary accident doesn't happen. Where things go sideways is after the airplane is secured, off the highway, and the pilot has already made arrangements for a mechanic to disassemble the airplane and haul it away. And that's when they tell him that the plane is being impounded. And not for a bad landing, not because he refused to cooperate. No, they say he violated Resolution 59-78, a tribal law passed in 1978 that bans aircraft from flying over the Red Lakes land below 20,000 feet. Let me repeat, no airplane under 20,000 feet over the reservation. It doesn't distinguish whether this is MSL or AGL, but regardless, if you're not a pilot, 20,000 feet is airline territory. Most general aviation flights, especially in a Stinson, are down in the 3,000 to 10,000 foot range. Now, this tribal rule has been on the books for almost 50 years. And no pun intended, but it's tribal knowledge only. Not one pilot would know anything about it. Originally, it came from a fight with the Air Force over some low-level training routes that were going over that land back in the 70s, but it's written very broadly. Any airplane below 20,000 feet over tribal lands. And this October, after Darren's engine failure, the Tribal Council reposted and told their residents to report low-flying aircraft over the land. So from their point of view, it's simple. He was flying over their land, presumably below 20,000 feet. He had an emergency landing on reservation land, and that highway runs inside their borders. Therefore, he broke the rule, and the airplane is now evidence and leverage. Now, from Darren's point of view, and frankly the FAA's, this is patently insane. To understand why this is such a big deal, you have to zoom out from this failed engine to the way airspace works in the United States. Federal law, and specifically Title 49, says the United States government has exclusive sovereignty over the airspace, and it recognizes a public right to transit through navigable airspace. In practice, that means the FAA owns the airspace. They define where you can fly, where you can't fly, how it's charted, and on the FAA charts over Red Lake, you see Upper Red Lake, Lower Red Lake, and the edges of some military operations in the area off to the east. There's this published T route where the IFR traffic is expected to fly low, not above 20,000 feet. What you don't see is any note that this is closed tribal airspace. So you've got a tribal resolution claiming a dome of air up to 20,000 feet and a federal chart that treats that same airspace as normal, navigable airspace with an established low altitude route through it. Now, Darren's argument, and the argument of a lot of aviation groups, is basically if a tribe can carve out private airspace, it should be coordinated with the FAA and charted like every other restricted or special use airspace. You can't retroactively criminalize a pilot for flying a route at an altitude that the FAA has never marked as special. And more than that, in an engine out, your job is to save lives and property, not to pull out a tribal code book to cross-reference a 1978 resolution. Now, weeks after the incident, the Red Lake updated the public with their official statement on the situation. Their claims lean heavily on sovereignty. They say this is reservation land, and there's been no prior coordination. The landing created a safety and a liability and a resource protection concern. Now, they also say they have authority over their lands and the people, and they're willing to engage with the FAA to clarify protocols going forward. So on one side, you've got a tribal sovereignty claim over the land, and on the other hand, you have a federal sovereignty over the airspace. And right in the middle is this tug of war for one man's airplane, sitting unprotected in the elements, going absolutely nowhere. At the time of recording, here is where things sit. The plane is still impounded on the Red Lake Nation land. Darren has retained legal counsel that is allowed to practice on tribal court, because your lawyer has to be approved by their court in order to help you. Now, they'd set a tribal court date for early November, but then they'd canceled it and didn't set a replacement date. Now, Darren and groups like AOPA and the Minnesota Pilots Association are preparing for a legal battle. And if he loses in the tribal court system, the plan is to go to the federal court system to get the airplane back and challenge the 20,000-foot rule. So Darren's done everything right in the cockpit, and now he's stuck in the part of the process that feels very familiar to me. It's paperwork, politics, and a court system where the people who wrote the rules also control the venue. Now, I want to be clear about something because it mattered in my own case with the Hualapai, and I'm sure it matters the same here. Individual people inside the tribe were incredibly helpful. The same thing is happening here. The first response at Red Lake was exactly what you'd hope for. It was law enforcement keeping people safe. Nobody gets hurt. The problem isn't that tribal members don't care about safety. The problem is what happens when sovereignty gets stretched past the land into the sky in ways that aren't legitimate, and in ways that, if legitimate, aren't coordinated with the FAA, aren't marked on the charts that we actually use when we're planning flights, and end up punishing pilots for surviving an engine failure the way he was trained to do. If the federal government wants to recognize certain tribal airspaces, that's a conversation you can have. The FAA, not the tribes themselves, need to draw it, chart it, publish it, and brief it. What you can't do, or what you shouldn't be allowed to do, is to have a 47-year-old local resolution that no pilot can see sitting underneath a published low-altitude route, and then use that to seize an airplane from a guy who did a perfect dead-stick landing on a public highway. That's not safety. That's not protecting wildlife. That's turning a life-saving emergency into an opportunity to test how far you can push your sovereignty claims over the sky. When tribes, states, counties, or whoever starts using aircraft as pawns in a sovereignty dispute, they're not just picking a fight with one pilot, they're sending a message to every pilot flying over a remote country. And that is, if your engine quits here, your punishment may start the minute that you survive. And that's exactly backwards from how aviation safety is supposed to work. Now, unfortunately, with so many things, even if Darren gets the plane back, which is still not clear, but even if he can, the process itself is designed to be punishing. It's costly, it's stressful. In this case, it's wholly unjustified. I've spoken with Darren extensively extensively, as recently as today. And if you want to stay up to date on the story as it develops further, consider subscribing.